Welcome, brave souls. I am your guide into the realm of the unknown. Here, among these ancient tombstones and whispering trees, we uncover the most intriguing and terrifying stories that will send shivers down your spine. Encounter the supernatural in real life. Each story will transport you to a world where fear reigns and the line between the living and the dead blurs. Are you ready to face your fears? Let the stories begin. Deep in the heart of an ancient forest, far from the prying eyes of civilization, lies the Whispering Cemetery. It is a place forgotten by time, overgrown with gnarled trees and tangled vines. The cemetery, shrouded in perpetual mist, is known only through whispered legends passed down through generations. It was a moonless night when Elizabeth, a young journalist with a taste for the macabre, decided to investigate the Whispering Cemetery. She had heard stories of the place since childhood, stories of eerie whispers that could drive people mad, of shadows that moved on their own, and of the restless dead. Armed with her camera and a notebook, she set out to uncover the truth. As Elizabeth approached the cemetery gates, a chill ran down her spine. The iron gates, rusted and covered in ivy, creaked open as if beckoning her to enter. She took a deep breath and stepped inside, the air immediately growing colder. The headstones, ancient and crumbling, were barely visible through the thick fog that clung to the ground like a shroud. Elizabeth walked slowly, her footsteps muffled by the damp earth. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. As she ventured deeper into the cemetery, she felt a growing sense of unease, as if unseen eyes were watching her every move. She stopped by an old oak tree, its branches twisted and bare. At its base was a particularly large and ornate tombstone, partially obscured by moss. Elizabeth brushed the moss aside and read the inscription. "Here lies Eleanor Blackwood, taken too soon. May she find peace in the afterlife." The name sounded familiar. Elizabeth remembered hearing about Eleanor Blackwood, a young woman who had mysteriously vanished over a century ago. Her disappearance had never been solved, and rumors of her restless spirit had fueled the cemetery's dark reputation. Suddenly, a whisper echoed through the air, sending a shiver down Elizabeth's spine. She spun around, but saw nothing. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, until it became a chorus of voices, all speaking at once. Elizabeth could not make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably mournful. Her heart pounding, she raised her camera and took a few shots of the tombstone and the surrounding area. As the flash illuminated the darkness, she thought she saw a shadow flit past the edge of her vision. She turned quickly, but again, there was nothing. Determined to stay calm, Elizabeth continued her investigation. She moved from grave to grave, taking notes and photographs. The whispers followed her, growing louder and more urgent. They seemed to be calling her, pleading with her to listen. As she reached the center of the cemetery, she found a small, decrepit chapel. Its wooden doors were ajar, and the interior was dark and foreboding. Elizabeth hesitated, but her curiosity got the better of her. She pushed the doors open and stepped inside. The chapel was filled with the scent of decay. Broken pews lined the aisle, and a thick layer of dust covered everything. At the front of the chapel stood an altar, behind which was a large, cracked mirror. Elizabeth approached the mirror, her reflection barely visible in the dim light. Suddenly the whispers ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence. Elizabeth felt a presence behind her and turned to see a figure standing in the doorway. It was a woman, her face pale and eyes hollow. She wore a tattered dress, and her hair hung in matted strands around her face. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. The woman seemed to glide towards her, her movements eerily smooth. As she drew closer, Elizabeth recognized her from old photographs. Eleanor Blackwood. "Eleanor," Elizabeth whispered, her voice trembling. The ghostly figure nodded slowly. "You must help me," she said. her voice echoing as if from a great distance. How? Elizabeth asked, her fear momentarily forgotten. I was wronged, Eleanor replied, betrayed by those I trusted. My spirit cannot rest until the truth is known. Elizabeth nodded, her resolve strengthening. I'll help you, she promised. Eleanor's ghost reached out and touched Elizabeth's hand. A wave of cold washed over her, and a series of vivid images flooded her mind. She saw Eleanor arguing with a man, then being pushed into a shallow grave. She saw the man and a woman covering the grave with dirt, their faces twisted with malice. The vision ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving Elizabeth gasping for breath. Eleanor's spirit began to fade, her form becoming translucent. Find my killers, she whispered. Bring them to justice. With that, Eleanor vanished and the chapel was plunged into darkness. Elizabeth stumbled out of the building, her mind racing. She had uncovered the truth, but her journey was far from over. She knew that the Whispering Cemetery held many more secrets, and that the spirits of the dead would not rest until their stories were told. As she made her way back through the cemetery, the whispers resumed, but this time they were different, thankful, almost hopeful. Elizabeth left the Whispering Cemetery with a newfound sense of purpose, determined to give voice to the forgotten souls and uncover the mysteries that lay buried in the shadows. Elizabeth's mind buzzed with the revelation of Eleanor Blackwood's tragic fate. Each step back toward the cemetery's gate felt heavier. Burdened by the spirit's untold stories, she could now sense all around her. She needed to dig deeper into the past, find out who Eleanor's killers were, and bring them to light. The restless spirits seemed to whisper their approval, urging her on. Back in her small apartment, Elizabeth spread out her notes and photographs. Her eyes kept returning to the vision of Eleanor's murderers. They were young, and their faces were etched in her memory with uncanny clarity. She knew she needed to visit the local historical society to delve into the archives and unearth the identities of these killers. The next day, Elizabeth found herself in the musty basement of the local historical society, surrounded by old newspapers, journals, and public records. She combed through countless documents until she stumbled upon a faded newspaper article from 1894, the year Eleanor vanished. The article described the search for Eleanor Blackwood, with references to her fiancé, Henry Caldwell, and her best friend, Margaret Wilson. Her blood ran cold as she recognized the names and faces from her vision. They were the ones who had betrayed Eleanor. With this newfound information, Elizabeth reached out to local authorities and presented her findings. They were skeptical at first, dismissing her claims as nothing more than sensationalism. However, Elizabeth's persistence paid off. She convinced a seasoned detective, Detective Harris, to reopen the case and investigate further. As Detective Harris began to dig into the Caldwell and Wilson family histories, strange things started happening to Elizabeth. She would hear footsteps behind her when she was alone, see fleeting shadows in her apartment, and feel a constant chill in the air. It was as if Eleanor's spirit and the other restless souls were growing impatient, pushing her to hurry. One evening, as Elizabeth sat in her living room, poring over her notes, she felt an icy hand grip her shoulder. She spun around to see Eleanor's ghostly figure, her expression desperate. "They know you're close," Eleanor whispered. "They'll try to stop you." "Who?" Elizabeth asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The descendants," Eleanor replied. "Henry's and Margaret's bloodlines. They still hold power in this town." Before Elizabeth could ask more, Eleanor vanished, leaving her in a cold sweat. She realized the gravity of her situation. The current members of the Caldwell and Wilson families were likely aware of her investigation and would do anything to keep their dark family secret buried. Determined, Elizabeth pressed on, taking precautions to protect herself. She shared her findings with trusted colleagues and friends, ensuring that if anything happened to her, the truth would still come out. One stormy night, as Elizabeth was driving back from another meeting with Detective Harris, her car skidded off the road. She fought to regain control, but the vehicle crashed into a tree. Dazed and bleeding, she saw two shadowy figures approaching her car. Panic surged through her veins as she realized the descendants had found her. Before they could reach her, the air grew impossibly cold, and the whispers from the cemetery filled the night. The figures froze, their expressions turning from menace to terror. Spectral shapes began to materialize, surrounding Elizabeth's car. Eleanor's ghost stood at the forefront, her eyes blazing with an otherworldly light. "You will not harm her," Eleanor's voice echoed, a command that reverberated through the night. The figures screamed as the spirits of the whispering cemetery closed in on them, dragging them into the darkness. Elizabeth watched in stunned silence as the ghosts avenged their long-standing grievances, ensuring that the past's sins would no longer be concealed. When Elizabeth finally came to, she was in the hospital, her injuries being treated. Detective Harris stood by her side, looking grave but relieved. "You're lucky to be alive," he said. "We found the descendants trying to flee the scene. They're in custody now, and they've confessed to everything. The truth about Eleanor's murder will finally come out." Elizabeth nodded weakly, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and sorrow. The spirits of the whispering cemetery had found their justice, and Eleanor could finally rest in peace. Days later, Elizabeth returned to the cemetery one last time. As she walked through the now tranquil grounds, she felt a gentle breeze and heard a faint, peaceful whisper. "Thank you." Elizabeth smiled, knowing she had done right by the spirits. She had given them a voice and ensured that their stories would never be forgotten. The whispering cemetery was now a place of peace, its dark past finally laid to rest. After Elizabeth's harrowing encounter and the subsequent revelations about Eleanor Blackwood, the whispering cemetery became a local sensation. Paranormal enthusiasts and thrill-seekers flocked to the site, eager to experience the eerie whispers and ghostly sightings for themselves. Elizabeth had moved on, but the cemetery's dark allure remained. One of these thrill-seekers was James, a seasoned paranormal investigator with a penchant for debunking myths. He had heard about Elizabeth's story and was convinced there was a rational explanation behind the phenomena. Armed with sophisticated equipment, James arrived at the whispering cemetery on a chilly autumn night, determined to uncover the truth. As James set up his cameras and recording devices, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The cemetery was eerily quiet, the mist clinging to the ground like a living entity. He checked his gear, ensuring everything was in working order, and began his investigation. The first few hours were uneventful. James wandered among the graves, occasionally stopping to take readings or snap photos. He scoffed at the idea of restless spirits, attributing the cemetery's eerie reputation to overactive imaginations and old legends. Then, just after midnight, things began to change. James was near the old oak tree where Elizabeth had first encountered Eleanor's grave when he heard a low, mournful whisper. He paused, holding his breath, straining to catch the words. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, and seemed to be coming from all around him. "Help us," the voices pleaded. "We are trapped." James's skepticism wavered as a chill ran down his spine. He activated his audio recorder, capturing the eerie sounds. The whispers intensified, and he felt a sudden drop in temperature. His breath fogged in the cold air, and he saw shadows flickering at the edge of his vision. Deciding to follow the whispers, James found himself drawn towards the decrepit chapel in the center of the cemetery. As he approached, the whispers grew louder, transforming into anguished cries. The air felt thick with dread, pressing down on him. Inside the chapel, James set up his equipment, hoping to capture definitive evidence. As he adjusted his camera, he noticed something strange. His reflection in the cracked mirror was distorted, almost malevolent. He shook his head, blaming fatigue and the eerie atmosphere for the hallucination. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted, and James saw his breath hanging in the air like smoke. The chapel doors slammed shut with a deafening crash, and the cries of the spirits turned into tortured wails. James's heart pounded as he realized he was no longer alone. From the shadows emerged a figure, its form shrouded in darkness. It was Eleanor, but her face was twisted in agony, her eyes hollow and filled with torment. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her voice a chilling echo. James tried to speak, but his throat was dry, and no sound came out. He fumbled for his camera, but it was useless. Every piece of equipment had gone dead. The spirits in the chapel began to close in, their ghostly hands reaching for him. Panic surged through James as he backed away, desperate to escape. The spirits' wails grew louder, their forms more defined and terrifying. He recognized some of them from historical records, victims of violent deaths, their souls bound to the cemetery by unresolved anguish. As James stumbled out of the chapel, he felt a searing pain in his chest. He looked down to see spectral hands clawing at him, leaving deep, icy marks. He ran, driven by sheer terror, but the spirits pursued him relentlessly, their cries echoing in his ears. Reaching the cemetery gates, James collapsed, gasping for breath. The spirits stopped at the threshold, their forms flickering like candle flames in the wind. Eleanor's ghost appeared before him, her expression one of sorrow and resignation. "The curse is real," she said softly, "and it binds all who die here. You cannot escape it." James stared at her, his mind reeling. He had come seeking the truth, and now he had found it. A truth more horrifying than he could have imagined. In the days that followed, James's condition worsened. He was plagued by nightmares, the spectral hands clawing at him even in his sleep. He tried to tell his story, but few believed him, dismissing his experiences as the ravings of a traumatized mind. Eventually, James's health deteriorated, and he succumbed to his mysterious injuries. His death was ruled as natural causes, but those who knew him believed otherwise. They whispered that the curse of the Whispering Cemetery had claimed another victim, and that James's restless spirit now wandered among the graves, seeking to warn others. The Whispering Cemetery remained a place of fear and fascination, its dark history growing with each new tale of terror. The spirits within, bound by their tragic fates, continued to whisper, their cries a haunting reminder of the cursed ground beneath their feet. For those brave enough to venture into the cemetery, the question was no longer whether the spirits were real, but whether they would ever escape the grasp of the Whispering Cemetery once they stepped within its gates. So, brave souls, our journey in the shadows is coming to an end for tonight. We hope that these stories have stirred your imagination and given you goosebumps. Remember, the world is full of secrets waiting to be discovered, and the line between reality and the supernatural is thinner than you might think. If you enjoyed today's stories and want to hear more creepy and unexplained, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you will be the first to know about new stories of horror and intrigue. Click on the bell icon so you don't miss a single creepy story. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, stay curious, stay brave, and remember, some doors are better left unopened.